My name is Brian, and on that night, the torrential rain was pounding so hard against the windshield that my wipers could barely keep up. The deserted road felt like an endless tunnel, illuminated only by the car's headlights. The silence and darkness surrounding me heightened the sense of isolation. I questioned why I had chosen this path on a night like this, but something was pushing me forward. I just wanted to reach my destination and escape the storm. Then I saw her, a woman, completely soaked, standing by the roadside, waving desperately. My first instinct was to keep driving. Who in their right mind would hitchhike on a night like this? But as I got closer, I saw her trembling, a look of desperation on her face that I couldn't ignore. My heart leapt with a mix of compassion and unease. I pulled over beside her and rolled down the window, letting the rain lash inside. "Do you need help?" I asked, almost shouting to be heard over the storm. She nodded quickly, her wide, frightened eyes reflecting the glow of the headlights. Without a second thought, I unlocked the door. She climbed in silently, her drenched hair and clothes clinging to her body. I cranked the heater to full blast, trying to warm the car and ease the tension already thick in the air. "Where are you headed?" I asked, attempting to sound calm as the car started moving again. She hesitated for a moment before giving me an address that didn't seem too far away. Her eyes, however, remained fixed on the road ahead, as if she were running from something, and that impression began to weigh on me. There was something more to this woman than just the rain and cold. The rain continued to hammer the car, creating an oppressive curtain of sound. The silence between us stretched awkwardly, and though I wanted to break it, something told me it might be better not to ask any more questions. Still, the feeling that something was very wrong kept growing. As we drove along the deserted road, the woman stayed uneasy, casting nervous glances at the window and rearview mirror. The atmosphere in the car was thick with tension, as if something invisible was building with every passing minute. I tried to stay calm, but the strangeness of the situation kept me on edge. "Is everything okay?" I asked again, hoping for an explanation that would ease the growing discomfort. She looked at me with wide eyes but took her time to respond. I just need to get home," she said, her voice shaky. There was a suppressed fear in her words, like she was hiding something. It sent a chill through me that wasn't from the weather outside. The rain fell even harder, and the car's lights reflected off the wet road, turning everything into a blur. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to at least break the barrier between us. She hesitated for a long second before answering. "Clara," she murmured, but the way she said it left me with an odd feeling, as if she were lying. I didn't press further. Something about this night didn't make sense, and now, with Clara beside me, everything felt even more mysterious and unsettling. The next few minutes passed in silence, but it wasn't the comfortable kind. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, as if something was about to happen. My heart was pounding, and the road ahead seemed darker and more ominous. The trees lining the roadside, nearly invisible through the rain, looked like shadows watching our every move. Then, unexpectedly, Clara began to cry. Silent tears streamed down her face. I can't go back home," she whispered, almost as if talking to herself. A shiver ran down my spine. What was she trying to tell me? And why did she seem so scared? I wanted to ask more questions, but the fear I saw in her eyes stopped me. "If you don't want to go home, I can take you somewhere else," I suggested, trying to make sense of what was happening. But Clara just shook her head, her shoulders still trembling. "No, I need to go there. There's nowhere else," she said with a trembling voice. Something about her response unsettled me deeply. What kind of situation would force someone to go to a place they feared so much? The road became even more desolate, and Clara shrank into her seat, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside. The discomfort in my chest kept growing. I wanted to know more, but something told me that the more questions I asked, the more disturbing the answers would be. I decided to focus on the road, even though the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Suddenly, Clara pointed ahead. "There, that's it," she said, her voice sending a shiver through me. I looked where she was pointing, and my stomach dropped. An abandoned, decaying house with broken windows and crumbling walls stood before us. The place looked more like a nightmare than a home. I slowed the car, a deep sense of unease gripping my instincts. "Are you sure you live here?" I asked, unable to hide the skepticism in my voice. She nodded but didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the house, and I could see her body tense, as if bracing for something. A deep chill ran through me. Everything about this situation screamed danger, but I didn't know how to react. Clara opened the door and stepped into the rain without hesitation. I watched her walk toward the house, a growing sense of dread gnawing at me. Something inside me told me to drive away, but my feet felt glued to the floor. My eyes locked on her figure disappearing into the darkness. My mind raced for explanations. None of it made sense. How could anyone live in a place like that? The house was in ruins, clearly abandoned for years, yet Clara entered as if it were her home. The rain hammered against the car, but the sound felt muffled by my own thoughts. I felt an urgent need to leave, but something held me back. Then something happened that made my heart nearly stop. A faint light flickered inside the house. A house that clearly had no electricity. I sat frozen in my seat, trying to process what my eyes were seeing. The light flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging everything back into darkness. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity and fear swirled inside me. Was she really in there? Should I go in and try to help her? I looked again at the house. The rain dripped down its decaying walls, and the place seemed swallowed by its own decay. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to decide what to do. My fingers trembled, and the sensation of being watched grew stronger with every passing second. It felt as though the house itself was alive, waiting for something or someone. Finally, I decided I couldn't just leave without knowing. I stepped out of the car, the sound of rain hitting the ground the only thing breaking the eerie silence. As I walked toward the house, a creeping sense of panic took over my body. With every step, the fear grew, as though the air around me was becoming thicker. I knew that stepping inside that place would cross a line from which I couldn't return. The house seemed to breathe with a life of its own, and the silence that settled as I approached made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I reached the front door, hesitating. I put my hand on the cold doorknob, but my mind screamed at me to turn back. Yet a faint sound, almost imperceptible, came from inside. Was it Clara? Or maybe something else? Without thinking further, I pushed the door open with a creak. The interior was dark, and the stench of mold and decay hit my nose. I took a step inside, lighting my way with the dim glow of my phone. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the sound of the rain outside felt distant. I moved forward, my footsteps echoing on the old wooden floor. "Clara?" I called, my voice shaky. There was no response. The only thing accompanying me was the sound of my own feet and the sensation that something was watching me from the shadows. I climbed the stairs, the creaking of the steps growing louder with each step, as fear crept deeper into my mind. When I finally reached the top, I stopped, feeling my heart race. I knew something was about to happen, but I wasn't ready for what came next. The silence upstairs was almost tangible. Darkness filled every corner, and the light from my phone seemed insufficient to dispel the feeling that something was watching me. I passed through the first doorway, entering an empty room. The smell of rotting wood and dampness was suffocating, and the air felt thick with something invisible, but threatening. A chill ran down my spine. As I illuminated the room, I heard a sudden noise. A door closing, with a dull, heavy sound. My heart raced, and I quickly turned toward the hallway. The sound came from the far end of the hall, from the last door. I knew Clara was there, or at least, I wanted to believe it was her. My mind was already imagining the worst. I walked slowly toward the door, my breath heavy and my senses on high alert. Each step felt like a challenge to my own instinct for survival, but I needed to know. When I finally reached the door, I placed my hand on the knob, hesitating. For a moment, I considered turning back, leaving the house and never looking back. But the mystery and fear pushed me to continue. I opened the door slowly, the creaking echoing through the hallway. The dim light illuminated the room's interior. It was the closet that caught my attention. The door was ajar, and the darkness inside it seemed deeper than the rest of the room. The feeling of being watched grew even stronger, almost unbearable. Something was there. My hand trembled as I approached the closet. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I was one step away from discovering what was really happening. "Clara?" I called, my voice weak. There was no response, just silence and darkness, which seemed to close in around me. With a quick movement, I flung open the closet door, and my blood ran cold. A man was crouching there, his eyes gleaming in the dim light, locked on me. His face was dirty, his hair disheveled, and he held something in his hand that I couldn't immediately identify. His gaze was intense, unnerving. A deadly silence hung between us, and for a moment, I couldn't move. He didn't say a word. He just kept staring at me, motionless, as if he were evaluating me, waiting for something. My thoughts were in chaos. Who was he? How had he gotten there? Where was Clara? Panic flooded me, and I knew I had to get out of there, but my feet felt glued to the floor. It was as if his gaze held me in place, suffocating me. Suddenly, he moved, a small gesture, but enough to make me react. I backed away quickly, nearly tripping, trying to put distance between us. My breathing was short and ragged, my hands sweaty, and I knew I couldn't stay there. That man wasn't Clara. I was dealing with something far worse than I could have imagined. I ran out of the room, down the stairs as fast as I could, moving with a speed I didn't know I had. Every step seemed to want to hold me back, as if the house were alive, trying to keep me there. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the place, and the only thought in my mind was to escape. Get to the car, drive away, and never look back. When I finally burst out of the house, the cold rain hit my face, but the fresh air was an immediate relief. I ran toward the car, my heart still pounding. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the man was following me. I didn't want to know what was really happening in that house. I just needed to leave. I jumped into the car, started the engine, and floored the accelerator. The road stretched out before me, and raindrops slid down the windshield. But even as I sped away, the feeling that something was watching me didn't leave. Whatever it was, that night would never be forgotten. The mystery of that house, that woman, and that man would stay with me forever. As I drove off, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the silhouette of the house disappearing into the darkness. But to my horror, for a brief moment, I saw Clara standing by the side of the road, watching me silently. When I blinked, she was gone, but the terror I felt would haunt me. Something had changed that night, and I knew that wherever I went, the mystery and the fear would stay with me. It was a long, dark night, and I was driving home after an exhausting day at work. The road was completely deserted, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me. The car's headlights cut through the night, but there wasn't much else, just the sound of the engine and the overwhelming fatigue taking hold of me. I was almost home when I saw something strange in the distance, by the side of the road. There was someone standing there. As I got closer, I realized it was an elderly woman. She was standing still, waving hesitantly. At first, I thought about just driving on. After all, it was late, and I was exhausted. But something about her made me hesitate. Maybe it was the desperate look on her face, or the fact that she seemed so out of place, alone in the middle of the night. I decided to stop the car. I rolled down the window and asked, "Do you need help, ma'am?" She smiled at me, a small, tired smile, and said in a weak voice, "I need to get home before it gets completely dark." That phrase caught me off guard since the sky was already pitch black. I felt a twinge of discomfort, but convinced myself it was just her way of speaking. Against my better instincts, I invited her into the car. She accepted without hesitation and climbed in slowly, clutching an old handbag tightly. Once she closed the door, I turned on the heater and started driving again. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She responded vaguely, saying her house was near the last bend. I had never heard of that place before, but I kept driving, the oppressive silence settling in the car. The night was cold, and the darkness seemed thicker as we drove down the road. I felt uneasy, but I tried to focus on driving. Still, a strange feeling started growing inside me, as if something wasn't right, as if I was being led to a place I should never know. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the sound of the engine and the rustling of trees as we moved along the deserted road. I tried to make conversation to break the tension. "Have you lived around here for long?" I asked, more to fill the quiet than out of real curiosity. She took a few seconds to respond, her eyes fixed on nothing in front of her. "Yes, for a long time," she replied, her voice low and distant. She didn't seem interested in continuing the conversation, and her answer only added to my discomfort. With each passing mile, the road seemed to stretch longer, and the darkness around us grew deeper. She clutched her old handbag so tightly that her knuckles were white. Something about her behavior made me uneasy. Then I noticed she was murmuring something to herself, disconnected phrases, spoken in a nearly inaudible tone, like a mantra repeated over and over. I strained to hear better. "Get there in time before it's too late," was all I could catch. A shiver ran down my spine, but I didn't want to ask her directly what it meant. Maybe it was just an odd habit, I tried to rationalize. Still, something deeply disturbed me. The road seemed darker than I remembered, and the woman beside me seemed stranger by the minute. I decided to try to learn more about her. "What's your name again, ma'am?" I asked casually, but there was tension in my words. She slowly turned her head toward me and responded with a faint smile. "My name is Helena Whitaker." The name echoed strangely in my mind, but I couldn't figure out why. Maybe it was just the fact that I finally knew something about her, or maybe it was the enigmatic smile that accompanied the response. Whatever it was, I turned my eyes back to the road, trying to shake the feeling that we were heading towards something far bigger than I had imagined. Helena kept murmuring softly, and every time I heard the phrase, "get there in time," a knot formed in my stomach. What did that mean? Get there in time for what? The discomfort began to shift into something closer to fear, but I kept my eyes on the road, trying not to let it show. We were passing through a part of the road I vaguely recognized, but something felt off. The landscape around us was darker, denser than usual. I started to question whether we were really heading in the right direction. "Are you sure we're on the right path?" I asked, trying not to sound annoyed or suspicious. She just nodded, her eyes still fixed on the road ahead. "Yes, we're close. My house is just after the last bend." I had heard that before, and the repetition of those words gave me a sense of déjà vu. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the trees around us seemed to close in, forming a tunnel of darkness. Time felt like it was slowing down. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Helena kept clutching her handbag, and I could feel the invisible weight of the journey growing heavier. We were heading somewhere unfamiliar, guided by someone I barely understood. I started questioning my own decisions. Why had I stopped for her? Why hadn't I just dropped her off at a safer spot, closer to a town or a house? Now, we were far from anywhere familiar, on a road that was becoming narrower and more deserted. What kept me in this situation? Something about her both fascinated and terrified me at the same time. Suddenly, something appeared ahead. The road made a sharp turn, and beyond it, I saw an iron gate. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a house as I had expected. It was a cemetery, old and overgrown with weeds. My heart began to race. Helena looked at the gate with a calmness that unsettled me. "This is it," she said softly. I stopped the car, my mind spinning with a whirlwind of confused thoughts. The last bend had brought us to a cemetery, not a house. The rusted iron gate stood before us, and beyond it, there were old tombstones, shrouded in shadows and moss. The overwhelming feeling that something was very wrong became unbearable. I looked at Helena, hoping for some logical explanation, but she remained serene. She opened the car door slowly, as if she were exactly where she needed to be. "Wait," I said, my body tense. "Are you sure this is it? I don't see a house." She turned to me, her eyes gleaming in the darkness, and gave me a faint but enigmatic smile. "Yes, this is it. My home is beyond the gate." Those words made my heart skip a beat. Was she serious? As she stepped out of the car, I hesitated to follow. Something inside me screamed to drive away, but at the same time, I couldn't stop watching. I saw Helena walk toward the gate, clutching her bag tightly. It felt like a scene out of a nightmare. The wind blew softly, making the dry leaves swirl around the gravestones. I knew I shouldn't let this happen, but I was paralyzed. She paused for a moment, looking back at me over her shoulder, as if waiting for me to say or do something. My mouth was dry, and I tried to speak, but no words came out. Instead, Helena simply nodded and pushed the gate, which creaked painfully in the quiet of the night. The sound echoed through the empty cemetery, and her figure disappeared into the shadows of the gravestones. I sat there, motionless, as she vanished into the darkness. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave that place. And then, as if something snapped inside me, I opened the car door and stepped out, determined to understand what was happening. I couldn't just leave her there, not without knowing who she really was, or what she was looking for. I walked slowly toward the gate, my footsteps echoing on the ground covered in dry leaves. The wind continued to blow, and the soft creaking of the trees made everything seem even more sinister. I looked into the cemetery, trying to spot Helena, but there was no sign of her. The darkness and shadows of the tombstones made everything indistinguishable. My heart was pounding, and I was on the verge of panic. I called her name, my voice sounding strangely loud in that deserted place. Helena? The only response was the rustling of the leaves and the sound of the wind. The feeling of being completely alone in that cemetery hit me hard. She had simply disappeared, as if she had never been there. A shiver ran down my spine, and my mind struggled to find a logical explanation. I moved closer to the gate, hesitating before fully entering. Something inside me told me to turn back, to leave it all behind and never look back. But at the same time, curiosity, or perhaps the fear of not knowing the truth, pushed me forward. I took a few steps into the cemetery, looking around, hoping to see her emerge from the shadows. The tombstones were covered in moss and seemed to have been forgotten long ago. The place exuded a sense of abandonment, as if no one had visited it in years. My eyes scanned every corner, trying to spot her, but the truth hit me like a punch. Helena was gone. There was no trace of her, only the old gravestones and the eerie silence around me. I tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt heavy, as if I were trapped in a nightmare. The thought that something supernatural was happening began to invade my mind. She couldn't have just vanished like that, but at the same time, all I felt was an invisible presence, something I couldn't see but knew was there, watching me. Despite the growing fear, I kept walking through the cemetery. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground was trying to hold me there. The darkness seemed to thicken with every passing minute, and I started hearing strange sounds, small noises, like something or someone was moving among the gravestones. Helena? I called again, my voice now weaker, tinged with desperation. Silence was the only response, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see someone, or something, in the shadows. I knew I shouldn't be there, but it was as if something larger was pulling me deeper into that place. The search for Helena had become a search for answers, though I didn't know what answers I was seeking. I continued walking among the gravestones, and the place felt like a maze. The faint moonlight barely lit the way, and the trees around the cemetery cast long, disturbing shadows. I passed by several gravestones, all old and covered in moss, with nearly illegible names. But something ahead caught my attention. There was one gravestone that stood out, more visible, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I walked toward it, my heart racing. When I got closer, a chill ran through me. The name engraved on the stone was Helena Whitaker. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. The date of death was etched below the name. Many years ago, long before that night. It didn't make any sense. How could it be the same woman I had just given a ride to? My thoughts were scrambled, and panic took over me. I took a few steps back, looking around, as if the answer to what was happening could be found in the shadows surrounding me. But the only thing I found was the haunting silence and the emptiness of that revelation. Helena was dead, and I was in the middle of something I couldn't understand. As my mind struggled to process the disturbing truth I had just uncovered, Something out of the corner of my eye caught my attention. I turned quickly and, between the trees of the cemetery, I saw a figure. It was Helena. She was standing there, half hidden by the shadows, but her calm smile was clearly visible. My instinct screamed for me to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. She didn't move, just watched me from afar. The faint moonlight illuminated her face softly, but in a way that was unsettling. I didn't know if I was really seeing her, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The sight of a woman, who according to the gravestone had been dead for many years, standing there before me, was too terrifying to be real. I tried to shout, but no words came out. Helena stood there for a few more seconds before slowly retreating, disappearing among the trees and gravestones. It didn't look like she was walking naturally. It was as if she was dissolving into the darkness. The only sound left was the wind and the growing rustle of the leaves. My heart raced, and fear overwhelmed me completely. I needed to get out of there. The cemetery now felt alive in a way that was not natural. Every gravestone, every tree, seemed to hide something lurking. There was no more doubt in my mind. I had just witnessed something supernatural, something that shouldn't exist in our world. Helena wasn't just an old woman asking for a ride. She was an echo of something much darker. With my body trembling, I turned and ran back to the car, my feet crunching the dry leaves beneath me as panic took over. I felt like something was chasing me, but I didn't dare look back. All that mattered was escaping that place before it was too late. I jumped into the car and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The darkness around me felt even more intense now, almost suffocating. The engine finally roared to life, and I floored the accelerator, speeding down the deserted road. The feeling that something was following me wouldn't go away. The image of Helena, standing among the trees, continued to haunt me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something or someone emerging from the road behind me, but all I saw was darkness. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. The cemetery and Helena weren't things I could leave behind. I knew, somehow, that it would follow me forever. The road stretched out before me, but my heart was still racing. My hands on the wheel were sweaty, and my mind was spinning around what I had just witnessed. How could I explain this to anyone? I had given a ride to a woman who had been dead for years, and even now, far from that cemetery, I still felt her presence, disturbingly close. My mind searched for answers, but there were none that made sense. The only truth left was fear, a deep, primal fear that would not leave me alone. I kept driving as fast as I could, as if I were running from something invisible. But deep down, I knew I couldn't escape. That night would stay with me forever. Whatever had happened with Helena, she had left me with a disturbing truth. Something beyond our world exists, something we cannot comprehend. And now, I was part of it, carrying with me the memory of an encounter that should never have happened. The night was quiet and dark as I drove alone down a deserted road. There were no other cars in sight, just the sound of the engine and the light wind passing through the open windows. After a long day, all I wanted was to get home as quickly as possible. Then I saw something up ahead. A motorcycle stopped on the shoulder, with a man beside it. I slowed down and saw the man crouched near the bike, apparently trying to fix it. He was wearing a leather jacket and, strangely, dark sunglasses, even though it was night. I felt a slight unease, but the thought of leaving him alone in the middle of nowhere made me pull over. I rolled down the window. "Bike trouble?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. The man raised his head, looked at me for a moment, and without saying a word, just nodded. Something about him seemed off, but maybe it was just my exhaustion playing tricks on me. Even so, I offered him a ride. "If you want, I can take you to the nearest town." He hesitated for a second, but then walked over to the car and got in. As soon as he settled into the passenger seat, the atmosphere inside the car shifted. The silence between us was almost tangible, and for some reason, his presence made me uneasy. He didn't say a word, just adjusted himself in the seat and stared straight ahead. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. With the stranger beside me, I continued down the empty road, the sound of the engine our only company. The town was still far away, and I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a disturbing experience. The tension in the car was obvious. The man next to me was silent, motionless, just staring at the road ahead. I tried to ignore the discomfort, focusing on driving. His silence was unsettling, and every now and then, I glanced sideways, trying to get a better sense of who he was. But all I could see was the reflection of the headlights on the dark lenses of his sunglasses. The darkness around the road seemed to magnify the feeling of isolation. I hoped he would start a conversation, maybe thank me for the ride, but he remained mute. The longer the silence stretched, the more oppressive it became. I felt a growing need to break the tension, so I tried to start a conversation. "Are you heading into town?" I asked, trying to sound casual. His response was brief and cold, almost as if he was forcing himself to answer. "Yes." The way he spoke made me even more uneasy. It wasn't just the silence that bothered me. It was the feeling that he was hiding something. Something I couldn't quite figure out. I kept driving, but I couldn't relax. My mind raced, coming up with theories about who this man was and why he was there. As the silence persisted, I began to question whether I'd made the right choice in offering him a ride. Something inside me was screaming that I should have kept going, but it was too late now. I was stuck in the situation, and the town still seemed far away. The man remained there, unmoving, showing no signs of wanting to speak again. The discomfort grew with every mile we traveled. As we continued down the road, the atmosphere inside the car became increasingly tense. The man kept his eyes on the road, and the sense of unease intensified. It was strange how still he was, like he was frozen in the passenger seat. I glanced over at him occasionally, trying to pick up any clues about who he was, but his dark glasses and heavy leather jacket gave nothing away. I didn't know what to do. I tried turning on the radio to break the silence, but the music felt out of place, almost wrong in that moment. I quickly turned it off, which only made the silence feel even louder. The air in the car was thick, and I started to feel a slight anxiety creeping in. "Are you okay?" I asked awkwardly, trying to sound less tense than I felt. He turned his head slightly toward me but didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, it was just a short yes, so brief it gave me nothing to interpret. His voice was low and calm, but there was something about the way he spoke that left me uncomfortable. Time seemed to drag, and every minute inside that car felt like a small torment. I couldn't relax anymore, and the feeling that something was very wrong kept growing. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to figure out who this man was and why he seemed so off. I wanted him to ask to get out soon. I wanted this ride to end, but at the same time, something told me the worst was yet to come. I tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder and harder. The man's silent presence was affecting me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Something about him didn't make sense, and every time I tried to make small talk, he would respond coldly and evasively. It was like he was there, but at the same time, he wasn't. "Are you going somewhere specific?" I asked again, hoping for an answer that would help me understand him better. This time, he didn't even look at me. "It doesn't matter," was all he said. The dry, emotionless response made my stomach turn. I started seriously regretting stopping on that road. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was stuck in the car with a complete stranger who didn't seem to care about being friendly. Every second, the discomfort grew, and I began to wonder if he was planning something. Was he waiting for the right moment to act? My mind was full of paranoid thoughts, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. I decided the best thing to do was keep driving and hope he'd ask to get out soon. The problem was, the road seemed endless, and I was getting more anxious. The fear that something bad would happen consumed me, and I started driving faster, hoping he would finally want to leave. But he remained quiet, motionless, as if he were waiting for something. The city was still far away, and I wasn't sure how much more of this tension I could handle. Each minute felt like a test of my patience and emotional control. Then, in the middle of nowhere, with miles of road ahead of us and nothing around, he finally broke the silence. "You can drop me off here." His words were so unexpected that, for a moment, I thought I'd heard wrong. I looked at him, confused. "Here? But there's nothing around." He didn't explain. He just looked at me and calmly repeated, "You can drop me off here." The idea of leaving him in the middle of nowhere didn't make sense. There were no houses, no gas stations, nothing. Just the dark night and the sound of the wind outside. But for some reason, I knew insisting would be pointless. He didn't want to continue, and at that moment, all I wanted was to be rid of the situation. Reluctantly, I pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. The man slowly opened the door and got out without looking back. He walked a few steps away from the car, heading toward the emptiness of the deserted road. For a moment, I sat there, unsure of what to do. Everything felt surreal. Who in their right mind would get out in the middle of nowhere? Something wasn't right, and that strange feeling only grew stronger. Before he completely disappeared into the darkness, he stopped and turned to me. It was the first time he looked directly into my eyes. "You should have kept going." Those words, spoken with an eerie calm, sent chills down my spine. I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could react, he turned back around and vanished into the dark. My heart raced, and I knew something terrible had just happened. His words echoed in my mind, but I still didn't understand what they meant. For a few seconds, I sat frozen in the car, trying to process what he had just said. "You should have kept going." What did he mean by that? I was alone on the road now, but the feeling of imminent danger didn't fade. In fact, the atmosphere around me seemed to grow heavier. Something told me this wasn't the end. With trembling hands, I started the car again and began driving. The silence returned, but now it felt even more oppressive. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see him on the road, but there was nothing but darkness. Even so, the feeling that something was watching me wouldn't go away. I felt as if I wasn't alone, as if some invisible presence was still in the car with me. I kept driving, trying to stay calm, but his words continued to echo in my mind. The road seemed longer than before, and the idea of reaching the town felt distant. The further I drove, the more I felt that something was terribly wrong. The air in the car felt heavy, as if something was about to happen at any moment. Suddenly, the radio turned on by itself. Static filled the speakers, and I nearly jumped out of my seat. I tried turning it off, but the button wouldn't work. The sound was unsettling, like it was trying to tell me something. After a few seconds, the radio finally shut off, leaving a deep, unsettling silence. My heart pounded, and I didn't know what to expect anymore. Then I looked in the rearview mirror again, and there he was, standing in the middle of the road, watching me from a distance. There was no way he could have gotten there so quickly. I blinked, and he disappeared again. Now, I knew something was very wrong, and that this ride was far from over. The image of the man in the mirror burned into my mind. I couldn't believe what I had just seen, but I also couldn't ignore it. Something was following me, something I couldn't understand. I kept driving, trying to calm myself, but fear had already taken hold of me. I knew he was close, even if I couldn't see him. Each time I glanced in the mirror, I expected to see him again, standing on the road, watching me. But there was nothing. The road was empty, and the town still seemed so far away. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. I wanted to believe that all of this was just my imagination, but his words kept echoing. "You should have kept going." Time dragged on, and every mile I covered felt like a small victory. But the feeling of being watched never left. My eyes kept darting back to the mirror, and each glance filled me with dread. The air in the car was thick, and I knew I wasn't safe. Something was about to happen, and I didn't know what. Speeding up a little, I finally saw the lights of the town in the distance. A sigh of relief escaped my lips, but the fear remained, firm and unyielding. No matter how far I drove, the feeling that he was with me didn't fade. I just wanted to get there, to get off the road and leave this nightmare behind. But the road seemed longer than ever. I looked in the mirror one last time. There was no sign of him, but the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, was impossible to ignore. My heart continued to race, and I knew that somehow, he was still watching me. Finally, I reached the town, and the streetlights illuminated the inside of the car. The relief I expected never came. The sense of danger still lingered, and I knew something was off. I parked the car on the first lit street I found and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening, and I sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened. I glanced at the mirror one last time. There was nothing there. The man was gone, as if he had never existed. But the memory of him, and the words he'd spoken, would never leave my mind. "You should have kept going." What did he mean by that? Was he trying to warn me about something? Or was he part of something I would never understand? I stepped out of the car, feeling the cold night wind. The town was quiet, but something inside me was still on edge. I knew, somehow, that this experience would change me forever. What had happened on that deserted road was real, and the fear I felt still lingered. I looked around, trying to find some sign that everything was okay, but the feeling of being watched never fully went away. I walked down the sidewalk, trying to leave it all behind, but the mystery of the man and what he meant would never be solved. I knew that from this moment on, my life would never be the same. The city's silence was comforting, but the weight of the experience followed me. I would never forget that night on the deserted road, and the warning he left me with, "You should have kept going." I was heading home after a long day at work. The meeting had dragged on longer than expected, and now I was driving alone on a deserted, silent road. The sky was already pitch black, and the only light guiding me came from the car's headlights. Light rain trickled down the windows, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound, and the exhaustion was starting to weigh on my shoulders. All I wanted was to get home and leave this endless day behind. Suddenly, I saw something on the side of the road. At first, I couldn't make out what it was, but as I got closer, I realized it was a human figure. A man stood there, waving his hand, asking for a ride. A chill ran down my spine. Being alone on a deserted road was already unnerving, and now I was faced with a stranger in the dead of night. The situation made me uneasy, but for some reason, I slowed down. He was drenched from the rain, his shoulders slumped, and his eyes were barely visible under the shadow of the hood he wore. My instinct screamed at me to keep driving, to ignore him and move on. Yet, something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he seemed desperate, or perhaps it was the fear of leaving him alone in that darkness. Without thinking too much, I pulled over a few meters ahead of him. I slowly rolled down the window, and the sound of the rain grew louder, mixing with the muffled hum of the engine. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice hesitant. He stood silently for a moment, just staring at me with a strange, vacant look. The discomfort grew, but before I could change my mind, he simply got into the car without saying a word. As soon as the man entered the car, a nearly tangible weight seemed to fill the space. The silence between us was unsettling, as if he had no intention of communicating at all. I glanced at him briefly, but the hood still obscured most of his face. My heart pounded, but I tried to keep calm, maintaining a neutral expression. I turned on the heater, hoping that the warmth might bring some comfort to both of us. "So, where are you going?" I asked again, trying to sound friendly, though my voice wavered. The man remained quiet, staring straight ahead at the road. My mind began racing, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake by letting him into the car. Maybe he was lost, or perhaps something had happened, and he was in shock. Yet, that nagging feeling of unease refused to leave me. After a few minutes of suffocating silence, the man finally moved. Without saying a word, he lifted his hand and pointed toward a side road on the right, an even more deserted and poorly lit route. His signal was clear. He wanted me to take that road. I hesitated at first. I didn't know the route, and something inside me was screaming not to take it. But somehow, I ignored my instincts, and my fingers turned the wheel toward the side road. The car jolted slightly as we entered the less paved road, and the sound of the rain seemed louder here, almost oppressive. I glanced at the man, hoping for some kind of explanation or a word of thanks, but he remained as inscrutable as ever, his hood still concealing his face. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the anxious thoughts racing through my mind. I didn't know where this road led or why he had guided me here. As I drove down the deserted road, the discomfort inside me grew with each passing minute. The rain intensified, and the sound of the tires on the wet asphalt echoed in the absolute silence of the car. Why wasn't he saying anything? The entire situation seemed absurd, and my nerves were on edge. I kept glancing at the man beside me, hoping for an opening to start another conversation, but he remained motionless, almost like a shadow in the passenger seat. The side road seemed endless. Dark trees lined both sides, and the darkness seemed to close in on us. Each curve heightened the sense that we were getting farther and farther from safety. My breathing grew short and rapid, and my mind started to conjure disturbing scenarios. I needed to do something. "Listen, where exactly are you going?" I asked, trying to mask the fear in my voice. "This time," he answered. But the words that came out were even more unsettling than the silence that had preceded them. He mumbled something incomprehensible, fragmented phrases that didn't make sense. Something about being lost and needing to follow a specific path. His voice was low and raspy, as if he were talking to himself, not to me directly. My heart raced even faster. What did that mean? Was he confused? Or was it some sort of veiled threat? Unsure of what to do, I kept driving, but my mind was racing, desperately searching for a way out of this situation. It didn't make sense to keep following this road indefinitely, not knowing where we were headed. I began to consider turning back and returning to the main road. My gut screamed that this wouldn't end well if I kept going. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel, and my mind was made up. I couldn't keep driving down this road. The eerie silence, his incoherent murmuring, and the strange behavior were more than enough signs that something was wrong. I couldn't ignore the overwhelming feeling of danger any longer. "Look, I think we should turn back. This road doesn't seem safe," I said, trying to sound rational, though the fear was evident in my voice. But the man didn't respond. He continued murmuring something inaudible, staring out the window as if completely oblivious to my presence. I began to slow down, preparing to turn around as soon as I found a space to do so. My heart pounded in my chest as I desperately searched for an exit. No matter what this man said or did, I wasn't going to follow his directions any longer. That's when I felt his hand on the steering wheel. It was a sudden, unexpected move. He lunged toward me, gripping the wheel tightly and forcing it in the opposite direction. For a moment, I was paralyzed, unable to comprehend what was happening. He was trying to stop me from turning back. My heart raced, and panic set in. "What are you doing? Let go!" I shouted, but he didn't respond. He just kept forcing the car down that desolate road. I couldn't breathe properly, and my mind was in complete chaos. His grip was strong and unyielding, and I struggled to maintain control of the car. The situation had gone from strange to utterly terrifying. I had to act fast before I lost complete control. Panic surged through me as I fought against him for control of the steering wheel. His strength was surprising, and no matter how hard I tried, he seemed determined to keep the car on the path he wanted. My hands were shaking, and I knew that if I didn't do something quickly, I'd end up following this unknown road with no way back. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel each pulse in my temples, and my breathing was rapid and shallow. I was terrified, but a part of me knew I had to act. Without thinking, I eased my foot off the accelerator, hoping that the decrease in speed would make him loosen his grip on the wheel. To my surprise, he didn't seem to notice right away, still focused on keeping control of the car. I seized the opportunity and yanked the wheel with all my strength, trying to regain control and steer the car back toward the main road. For a moment, he let out a low grunt, frustrated with my resistance, and his hand wavered. I took advantage of the moment and forced the wheel back in the direction I wanted, praying I had enough time to escape this madness. "Let me go!" I screamed with all the force I could muster, but he didn't seem to hear me. He was entirely focused on stopping me from turning back. The situation was becoming unbearable. I knew that if things continued like this, something worse would happen. Desperate, I decided to try one last move. I slammed on the brakes hard, making the car lurch violently, hoping it would throw him off balance. The screeching of the tires on the wet pavement echoed loudly in the silence of the night, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. My sudden maneuver worked. The man lost his balance from the abrupt stop and loosened his grip on the wheel. It was just enough time for me to yank the steering wheel back and direct the car toward the main road. My heart was racing as I fought to keep control of the car skidding on the wet road, but I felt a wave of relief as I realized I had regained control. However, before I could celebrate, he lunged at me again, this time with a fury I hadn't seen before. His strong hands grabbed my arm, yanking it so forcefully that I nearly lost control again. "Stop! Let me go!" I screamed, but he kept fighting, trying to prevent me from driving away from that road. Fear and desperation morphed into pure adrenaline, and I knew I had to act quickly. I tried using my elbow to push him away, but he was much stronger than I'd anticipated. His hands were like claws digging into my arms, firm and relentless. The pain was setting in, and the thought that he might hurt me even more terrified me. I had to do something, and fast. That's when I had an idea. If I accelerated again, maybe I could catch him off guard and gain the upper hand. Without hesitation, I slammed on the gas, making the car surge forward. The sudden acceleration threw him off balance even more. His eyes widened momentarily, clearly not expecting my reaction, and I saw an opening. With all my strength, I gripped the wheel with one hand and used the other to push him away, shoving him hard against the window. When his head hit the window, he let out a groan of pain and, to my relief, slumped back against the seat, apparently unconscious. My entire body trembled, my heart racing, as I tried to process what had just happened. My first instinct was to slow down, but the fear that he might wake up at any moment kept me speeding along the road. The sound of the rain was deafening, and every drop that hit the windshield seemed to amplify the sound of my thoughts. I needed to get off this road, back to the safety of the main road. The image of the man passed out beside me sent chills down my spine, and I knew that as soon as I had the chance, I had to get rid of him. The thought of what could have happened if he'd succeeded in overpowering me made my stomach churn. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I needed to focus on the road and find the best way out of this situation. I glanced at the man next to me. He was slumped over, his head tilted to the side, his breathing heavy and irregular. Was he really unconscious? The thought made me shiver, and my instinct was to keep driving, not daring to look at him again. Finally, I saw the distant lights of the main road. A wave of relief washed over me, as if I had finally escaped that nightmare. The panic hadn't fully subsided, but at least I was closer to getting out of this situation. Now, I just had to get rid of him. As soon as I was safely on the main road, I would pull over and leave him behind. With the lights of the main road getting closer, I began to slow down. My body was still trembling, but now I had a chance to get rid of the man. I pulled over onto the shoulder, the engine still purring softly, and looked at the man once more. He was still slumped over, his head leaning to the side. I took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage to do what I had to do. I opened my door and ran around to the passenger side. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the door, my heart racing with the fear that he could wake up at any moment. With all the strength I had, I managed to drag his body out, pushing him onto the ground with all the force I could muster. The man collapsed onto the wet asphalt, motionless. I stared at him for a moment, my mind still spinning. He lay there, unmoving, and all I could think was how surreal the whole thing felt. With my heart still pounding, I rushed back to the car, ready to drive away as fast as I could. But before I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when true terror hit me. The man wasn't lying down anymore. He was standing, right at the edge of the road, staring directly at me. His eyes, now visible beneath the drenched hood, gleamed with a terrifying intensity. My body froze with fear. He shouldn't have been awake, not after what had just happened. But there he was, standing still, watching me as if nothing had happened. The sight of him standing there, locked on me, made my blood run cold. I didn't wait any longer. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, but the image of him in the rearview mirror continued to haunt me, etched into my mind forever.